Welcome to Nightlight. Step away from the mainstream and gather around as we enlighten the world and our realities and travel this cosmic journey we call life. Join us as we share with you and provide that beacon that can guide us all to a better way. Explore with us as we examine a metaphysical montage of spiritual insights, covering everything from the mundane to the magical, UFOs to unicorns, and everything in between. This is a time of awakening, of sharing and evolving, of spreading our wings and soaring on the cosmic breath of creation. Come and join with other light-minded spirits as we weave our lights together to seek understanding, enlightenment, and with a little luck, some wisdom. This is Nightlight, a reminder that you are never alone.
Welcome, everybody. As you can hear, the pollen has gotten to me yet again, so I'm going to sort of croak my way through this evening. We have a great book that fascinated me, and that helped to enlighten me in many ways about some of the things that we've been talking about for years and years now. The name of the book is called Tripping the Trail of Ghosts, Psychedelics and the Afterlife Journey in Native American Mound Cultures. And it's something that I had not really thought about or considered, and yet after reading the book, I'm wondering why I didn't. It's a fascinating book, and it talks about the use of hallucinogenic substances like peyote and desert tobacco has long played a significant role in the spiritual practices and traditions of Native Americans. While the majority of those practices are well documented, the relationship between entheogen and Native Americans of the Southeast have gone highly unexplored. Examining the role of psychoactive plants in afterlife traditions, sacred rituals, and spirit journeying by shamans of the Mississippi and Mound cultures, P.D. Newman explores in depth the Native American death journey known as the Trail of Ghosts or Path of Souls. He demonstrates how practices such as fasting and trance work, when used with psychedelic plants like gypsum weed, black nightshade, morning glory, and amanthea, and silibun mushrooms, could evoke the liminal state between life and death in initiatory rites and spirit journeys for shamans and chiefs. He explores the earthwork and platform mounds built by Indigenous cultures of the Mississippi Valley, showing how they quite likely served as early models for the Path of Souls. He also explores similarities between the Ghost Trail Afterlife Journey and the well-known Egyptian and Tibetan Books of the Dead. That's a comparison that hasn't been made a lot, and I think it's important that we kind of recognize it and give it its due. P.D. Newman has been immersed in the study and practice of shamanism, alchemy, hermetism, and theurgy for more than 2 decades. He's the author of Theurgy, Theory and Practice, and Angels in the Vermilion. He lives in Mississippi, so he has hands-on for a lot of this material, and it was fascinating for me to realize that when I had my huge garden, when I lived in Connecticut, that I was growing a lot of plants that could easily set me on trips that I had not even thought of. Of course, I didn't stew them the appropriate way, but I could have. So I want to welcome Danny to the show. Danny, thanks so much for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Barbara.
So delighted that you're bringing a lot of stuff to the fore that I hadn't really thought about. Now I know a lot of the plants that I grew in my garden, like digitalis, can be a poison and things like that, but the morning glories and the mushrooms and all of the other flower essences and tobacco even, that they utilized in order to induce trances and to get into other levels of consciousness, I was fascinated with.
Yeah, they had a very sophisticated pharmacopoeia, and a number of them, for example, the datura, the black nightshade. These are plants that, when discussed in the context of shamanic or shaman-like practices, magic, they're usually thought of in terms of European witchcraft. They're the kind of ingredients we see in flying ointments, for example. But and for those who aren't familiar, flying ointments kind of served as a means of inducing an out-of-body experience, what we would call that today. They didn't think of it in that way, but they would fly to the quote-unquote witch's Sabbath, which was an otherworldly type space. And within the domain of European plant medicines and the research on that, it hasn't really been thought of as a spirit journey. It's been thought of more as this kind of something that was coaxed out of the witches through torture, through the women accused of witchcraft. But when we see how it was applied in other contexts, like these here in North America with the Native Americans of the Southeast, it was used to induce a very similar kind of experience, and it sheds a lot of light on the role that these plants likely played everywhere that they were native, that they could grow.
I think that the thing that fascinated me was that nicotine as well, with the chewing of the tobacco leaves and the use of nicotine. I mean, it took my view of the indigenous peoples from, well, they're holistic. They eat, meat, and they grow their vegetables, and they have very healthy diets. And yet they had all of these different concoctions that they were brewing that would take them into other realms. And I always thought that it was just the smoke that got them when they were in their sweat lodges or whatever, that enabled them to do stream of consciousness work or out of body experiences. But from everything that I read, they had lots of different brews. The black liquid that they talk about brewing.
Black drink. Yeah. And their tobacco. So commercial tobacco is made from Nicotiana tabacum. Well, the type they were using is called Nicotiana rustica, and not only can it be anywhere between 3 and 9 times as potent as commercial tobacco in terms of nicotine content, it also contained monoamine oxidase inhibitors, just like we see in the ayahuasca brew that's used in South America, in the form of, I believe it's harmine. It may be harmaline, but either way, it's one of those harmala-related alkaloids. So when you combine the two, the tobacco with the MAOI, there's an entourage effect. They synergize, and it increases its potential for shamanic out-of-body type experiences all the more. And even with its increased potency, when you look at the early literature of archaeologists and anthropologists that are down in South America, these shamans were smoking cigars that were up to 3 feet long,
Oh my gosh.
and they're consuming it in one sitting. Now, when I first started on this research, I've always had an aversion to tobacco, largely because I grew up with asthma. I never smoked tobacco at all. You know, I was around it, but I never had any experience with it. And I was already kind of perturbed by the idea that something so common, you know, you look around and people are smoking all the time. How can it be that effective in terms of inducing those types of experiences when clearly the guy smoking on the corner isn't having an out-of-body experience, isn't going through these types of experiences? So I really struggled with that. But the way they're using it and the amounts that they're using, and also in conjunction with other trance-inducing techniques, it can quite literally induce a death experience. And before they get to this point, it wipes out the color system, your ability to perceive colors in the world, and everything takes on a ghostly yellowish gray kind of tint, which was interpreted as the two worlds, the land of the living and the land of the dead, starting to merge. You're seeing in a ghost world that overlays our own, is how they interpreted this.
Wow.
But with continual use, if they keep pushing it and pushing it, they can quite literally physically go to where you can't tell if they're alive or dead. The breathing gets so shallow that you can't detect breath. The heartbeat gets so subtle that they can't detect a heartbeat. So even for the observers, it's inducing a death experience, right? And then they have a means of pulling them back out of this. So, and when in South America, when they would go to this length with the tobacco, usually they were in the company of another healer, another seer, that would then use other plants or sometimes more tobacco to pull them, to kind of jolt them out of this very, very deep trance. So yeah, it was something that, you know, I knew I would have to get some kind of firsthand experience with it if I were going to treat it faithfully in the book. And so, you know, still have breathing issues. So naturally, I wasn't going to turn to cigarettes, and I didn't want to mess with Nicotiana tobacco anyway. So I ordered some Nicotiana rustica seeds, and I grew some tobacco. I learned how to cure it, which I recommend with any plant you're going to work with. Develop that relationship with the plant. But I started by smoking a pipe. I got a really nice Peterson pipe and consecrated it towards this purpose. And I didn't get a third of the way through this thing before I was pouring sweat. The room was spinning, and I understand that's common with people with just cigarettes. But the next thing that happened was completely unexpected for me. I passed out. My head dropped, and I was, to the world, unconscious. But visually, I have a lot of experience with visionary plants. Never thought of tobacco in this kind of a context, but I started seeing bolts of lightning and horses running towards me. I mean, it induced a full-on visionary experience. So I say all this for the listeners that just like me are thinking, how could tobacco be that effective? Well, it absolutely it is in the way they were using it.
Well, did Europe learn about tobacco from us, or were they smoking something else in Europe prior to tobacco?
No,
So
they were smoking, but it wasn't, when we say they, I don't want to, it wasn't a cultural phenomenon. You know, you might have the occasional healer who was aware of herbs that could be smoked. And the evidence shows that when they were doing this, it was usually more in the context of a fumigation, right? Where they would burn it almost like we burn an incense, and they would do it in an enclosed space or in a tent or under a cloth. So they were smoking, but it wasn't until Columbus came and brought tobacco back to Europe, and then it spread like wildfire. Everybody absolutely loved it.
You know, somehow you don't think about the old world getting something new from the new world, really. You know, they were here to bring us to Christ and stuff. But the thought that the hallucinogenics were there, and of course the peyote probably wasn't over there either.
The peyote, what you mentioned, the role of morning glory. The natives were using the seeds for their hallucinogenic potential because they contain lysergic acid amides, which is a precursor and close cousin to lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD. But in Europe, at one time, the root of a certain species of morning glory, which is the particular species escapes me, but it'll come to me in a minute. But it was so effective for treating digestive and gastric problems that at one time it was the most imported plant in the world, and that came from their contact with the Americans. All morning glory species originate in Central America, and were brought north and to Europe. But yeah, that was from here too. You're right. You don't really consider things moving in that direction. We usually, when we think about history, we think about it all coming over on the Mayflower,
Yeah, I think one of the I can't remember exactly where it was in your book, but there is were places where on the rock art they had symbols for the different plants, and beneath where the symbols were those plants actually growing.
That's right. Yeah, this was a surprise to me, and this wasn't in the case of the southeastern natives. And when I say southeast, I mean of the entire continent. So when we say southeast, this is inclusive of Canada. And so if for example I mentioned that the Mississippians were in Wisconsin, which is very far north for us in North America. But when you think of it in terms of the entire continent, we're talking about the southeastern portion. So basically, everything east of the Mississippi River is inclusive here, almost everything. Once we get up into New England, above New England, it kind of peters out. Shoot, why did I get it? What did you say? What was your question?
The rock art with
yeah, so this was in the case of the southwestern natives, not the southeast, but a very dear friend and brother Mason, Jamie Paul Lamb, brilliant author, probably the most talented astrologer in the country. I was visiting with him at his home in Phoenix, Arizona, and he knew that I was researching Native American practices and art, and he had mentioned to me that there was a petroglyph park nearby. It was probably a 40-minute drive, and he wanted to take me. And so we got there. I mean, it's in the desert, and there are these massive jagged rocks, and
Yeah.
they are covered in these petroglyphs. And as I'm looking at them, I'm a plant geek, so I'm looking at all the plant life around there too. And I saw datura, and I thought, wow, there's datura growing out here. And I told Jamie, I said, they were using this in a ritual context, usually in conjunction with tobacco. And the minute I got tobacco out of my mouth, I looked down and there's a Nicotiana obtusifolia tobacco plant growing. And I said, these are the two main plants. What are the odds that they'd be growing, right here? And then I started noticing that underneath every glyph was either the datura or the tobacco or both. And I said to Jamie, I said, they must just grow wild out here, huh? And he said, I don't think so. I've never seen these plants. And so we started, it's 11 acres, the whole park, and the rock art is only in one small section. So we just started kind of working a spiral and looking for other specimens. We couldn't find a single one. Every single specimen of either of those two plants were growing directly under the rock art. And so when I found this amazing thing, I contacted a friend of mine who is a botanist, and I said, what's the possibility? What are the odds that a plant could have been planted, maybe 500 to 1,000 years ago, and still grows in the same spot? And he told me, he said, oh, that's absolutely possible. And he said, in fact, if they reproduce by seeds, that's probably what's going to happen, is the seeds will fall and it will grow back in the same basic region over and over, unless there's something there, an animal or something, to come along and spread it. But with the case of these two plants in particular, there are no animals that come along and eat them, spread their seeds. So they were likely cultivated by the Native Americans and were still there today. Remarkable to me.
So let's take this to the mounds, because we have no really written records.
Mm-hmm.
All we can go by are what the archaeologists have found, and what they theoretically have determined things were meant to be. But what I found fascinating was that in the case of many mounds and burial sites that had these little cups that it signified that they were used to take spirit journeys, so to speak, with. They weren't what they drank their water or their honey water or their tea out of. It was what they took their spiritual drink out of.
That's right.
And did the number of cups, was that significant of the levels or the trips that person had possibly taken, or the level of their ascension as far as their journeying?
That's a good question. So these cups are actually the shells of a lightning whelk, and they're enormous. They're not like whelk shells we have today, which are small. These things were huge. They don't even grow this big anymore. And they preferred cups that spiraled to the left as opposed to the right. Every single one of them that they found were left spiraling. So that was significant for them. But they'll often have carved on the shell the depiction of one of their spirits. I'm reluctant to say gods, because that's a loaded term, and they didn't think about it in the same way. These were both ancestor and spirit, and what we might think of as a daemon and god, and they were very different in their approach to divinities. Excuse me. But after anthropologists, specifically it was at this one conference that was put together by F. Kent Riley, where they had all these symbols from the Mississippians, They didn't know what they meant, how they fit together. So he started holding this annual or biannual conference where he would invite archaeologists, anthropologists, and then natives from various tribes that had descended from the Mississippians to come and make an attempt to decipher what's going on with this iconography. And with the help of the late, great, brilliant George E. Langford, who recently passed away, as did Riley, it was discovered that all of these beings, virtually all of them, with very few exceptions, are related to this path of souls journey. And the path of souls is the also known as the trail of ghosts, the road of the dead. There are a number of analogous ways to translate the phrase, but the most common and most popular, well-known, path of souls. It's a model for the afterlife. It's where they believe that they can go, not necessarily do go, because this was secret initiatory wisdom. Not everyone had this wisdom. It was passed down in secret sodalities, secret societies that were graded, had degrees, kind of like Freemasonry. And with each grade came the knowledge of the next landmark, the next ordeal or trial that one could expect to face on the path of soul's journey. And Langford really, not by himself, but largely, I mean, he was responsible for making sense of this, and it's been corroborated by a number of tribes that are existent today. And so these cups, the symbols that are etched on them, and this was important because they noted that the cup would be buried with the person when they died. And it's common to bury the dead with grave goods, their journey, but in this case, everyone wasn't buried with them. It was only something that the elites, that the chiefs would have. And this, we finally discovered, was an indication of its function as a, I don't want to say status symbol, but it represented their identity in that it reflected their level of knowledge within that initiatory hierarchic structure that represented this afterlife model. Now, when they taught this in these rituals and in this kind of degree structure, number one, the mounds themselves and the placement of them came to represent a virtual ground, a virtual template that reflected the landmarks in the path of souls, in the afterlife. And this part is difficult for some to wrap their head around, largely because we're talking about drugs. But I want to be clear that these aren't addictive drugs. Tobacco is the exception. These other plants are not addictive. They're what's called entheogens, and an entheogen, it means something that generates an experience of the divinity within, of the soul. And we could say psychedelic. Psychedelic comes from the Greek words psyche and suke and delos, which means mind or soul manifesting. Mm-hmm. But hallucinogens, we don't use that word. That's a no word. That means that what they're seeing is wrong, that it's false, and that it's an illusion. They weren't interpreting it in those terms. They thought this was a very real experience of something objective, albeit only encounterable subjectively, right? But they would use these shell cups and the being depicted on them to induce what we would call a near-death experience, an out-of-body experience. So it was ritualized, but then also used on this whole other level where they're consuming datura. It could be black nightshade. The most common was datura and the Ilex vomitoria, the Yaupon holly. Now that's what scholars for a long time thought was all that went in these cups, and that's what they made that was called black drink. Yaupon holly, it's the only source of caffeine native to North America. It's a close cousin of yerba mate in South America. Both are species of ilex, of holly. And they would boil these leaves up to such a density, to such a concentration that it would turn into a black syrup. And that's where we get the phrase black drink. Now, when the natives were observed drinking this black drink out of these big cups, they would oftentimes drink and then vomit and then drink again and then vomit. And that led to its being called by botanists Ilex vomitoria, the ilex that causes vomiting.
Yeah.
And it was believed to be an emetic or a purgative. But it grows all over where I live. We have at least 8 natural growing specimens around our lake out in the field. And so I thought, well, I'm gonna put it to the test, because I knew that before coffee was brought over here, that the colonists that lived in the South, they would drink the ilex. That was how they got their morning caffeine before coffee was ever a thing here. So if they're able to drink it before they go work in the field for 8 hours,
Yeah.
it can't be that emetic. So I was really like, what is it? Is it emetic or isn't? So I started roasting the leaves and brewing it up and drinking it and making it more concentrated and drinking more amounts. I would get jittery, but at no point did I experience nausea or vomiting. And that's when I first got the suspicion that perhaps other plants were being added to this that could cause vomiting. And I was specifically thinking that not that it was ayahuasca, but that it could be possibly be something similar to that what would induce vomiting. So I say all that to say that these cups, they're drinking this substance to propel them into the domain of the spirit or deity that's depicted on the cup. So the pharmacopoeia they had, it wasn't like, oh, let's combine these plants and get an experience. They were able to craft specific experiences to cause an encounter with that specific being by calling on very specific plant substances, and then in conjunction with ritual, which, if you're familiar with the early literature on psychedelics that came out of Harvard in the 60s, the first thing that they really were able to pin down was that the experience is predicated on 2 factors, set and setting, which means your mindset when you go into the experience and the setting you're in. What's going on around you? Who are the people around you? Are you inside? Are you outside? The colors in the room, the music that's playing, all of these things can craft your experience. And they were very aware of this. And if you think about it, all set and setting is the clinical rediscovery of ritual, so effective ritual. So they are putting things in the perspective of the individual and crafting a potion to induce a very specific experience. And those came to represent not just their status in the tribe and in the reality, but their very identity. This was more than pride, a sense of pride of I've attained this. They really, in a way, became it. They were much more aware of how much what they do defines who they are and what they are. Where we've in meta modern times have really lost touch with that in a big way. We're able to go and work at the pizza shop or lay concrete. We don't see our jobs as defining us. We're separate from that, but they didn't think that way.
It sort of boggles your mind in looking at what they came up with and then realizing the trials and failures along the way to get to the point that it would take you to whatever it was you were seeking.
That's a good point.
You're talking about, in some cases, plants that are poisonous.
Yes, poisonous that could induce death.
Real
death. Not symbolic death, real death. That's right. Yeah. And the use of these plants, I mean, they probably go back to the dawn of mankind. It's only in the last 200 years that we've really divorced ourselves from these as a source of wisdom. And I mean that in terms of not just knowledge, but wisdom, true knowing to the degree that faith is almost unnecessary. Gnosis, we could say gnosis. But yeah, that's what they were doing. And when they tested a number of these cups that they found at Spiro. Spiro is a enormous mound complex in Oklahoma, and in one of the mounds there were thousands of these shell cups, and they tested the residues in them, and I don't remember the exact percentage. It was maybe 3/4 of them tested positive obviously for Ilex vomitoria, the caffeine content, but datura as well. And this particular location, Spiro has a mound that is hollow inside, and held up by enormous cedar posts, and inside of it is a temple. It's very similar to what is known as an earth lodge and other Native American traditions. But the entire structure of this temple was kind of like a fractal of the mound structures as a whole and of the Path of Souls. Everything present on the Path of Souls journey was inside of this mound, and which is a good indication that it functioned very much like a Masonic lodge. If you're familiar at all with the way a lodge is set up, everything in there is meant to represent King Solomon's temple, and right from the checkered floor up to the two pillars, everything in there. So it becomes a microcosmic reflection of this macrocosm that, through the use of the plant medicines, they're able to access the macro through the micro, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I think that, excuse me, thank you. One of the things that I found fascinating was that their ceremonies, their procedures, their levels of consciousness all relate so perfectly, first to the Masons, but then to the Egyptian, Book of the Dead.
Yes.
Book of the Dead. I mean, it takes those civilizations that we look upon as highly evolved, and it draws a direct correlation to what the First Nation people the Native Americans that were here first
Yes, they
doing.
I think an important point, and thank you for making it. Uh, of course, the Native Americans are usually often revered for, like you said, for their holistic lifestyle. Um, but granting them that they were extremely sophisticated and complex,
Yeah.
that's not something that we think of. Whereas with the Egyptians, it's a no-brainer. We think of them as this high ancient society possessed of wisdom that we've lost and will probably never get back. We need to do a 180 with the Native Americans and realize that this is true here also. Even with the mounds, many of them are truncated pyramids. They're pyramidal in shape with a flat top, and on that top was a structure that would have completed it, much like the capstone on the Great Pyramid. And with the pyramid texts, which are the inscriptions in the pyramid of Unas, the pharaoh Unas, many people operate under the false assumption that the pyramids are burial chambers, and they're not burial chambers. They were constructed for the celebration of a particular rite known as the Sed festival. And in this rite, it's designed for the renewal of the pharaoh. And this renewal is accomplished through a ritualized death and resurrection. So even though it's not meant for an actual death, it's only natural that because it's a symbolic death that we find in the pyramid text instructions for the dead.
Yeah.
So those instructions are still valid as an afterlife model. And the similarities between what the pyramid texts say and what they were doing in terms of the Path of Souls rituals and the model as a whole are astonishingly similar. The most obvious is with the Path of Souls, there are believed to be two portals located in the heavens at specific constellations. One of them, the most important, particularly for the Mississippians, and especially in and around Moundville, towards the end of the time of the Mississippians. Moundville was a necropolis. The constellation where the portal, which is called the Ogi, is located is in what we recognize as Orion. But obviously Orion is a Greek conception. They wouldn't have seen it as Orion the Hunter, but they nonetheless recognized and revered that particular cluster of stars. They called it the chief's hand. And it was seen as a hand that was hanging down like this. And in the iconography, it's often depicted with an eye in the palm, much like the Hamsa icon. But it's not an eye. It only looks like an eye. It's actually that portal. And its vesica piscis shape is actually meant to reflect the cowrie shell, tiny little shells that were used in their secret ceremonies, and particularly in the Midewiwin, which is known as the Grand Medicine Society. But I shouldn't say that. It's not upon death, because if they didn't die around the winter solstice, which was the time that this was visible in the sky, then the bones were housed in what was known as a charnel house atop one or more of the mounds. But the soul at death, or in the context of these shamanic trances, was launched at the portal towards the constellation of Orion in the form of an arrow. And then once it entered that portal, if you think about Earth, and then around Earth going this way, we have the ecliptic, where the sun rises in the east, travels overhead, and sets in the west. All the planets appear to follow this ecliptic from our perspective.
Mhm.
Well, going this way, actually, it's kind of at an angle, but so opposing this direction, we have the Milky Way going this way. So naturally, there is an intersection at 2 points where the ecliptic meets the Milky Way. That's what these portals were. And so they would get through this portal and then get on to the Milky Way, the path of souls, where the journey proper would begin to take place, where they would have encounters and ordeals and trials with a number of these different supernatural beings. And when we look at the pyramid texts, we see the same exact thing, that the pharaoh is instructed to leave the tiny little, I don't know, I don't want to call it an entrance, but it's a canal that goes out of the pyramid and faces directly at the constellation of Orion at the time of the said festival. And for them, it wasn't Orion. They recognized that cluster as Osiris. They called it Osiris. And it says for the pharaoh to climb the sky until he got to the constellation of Orion. And then once he got there, he was to become Osiris. So he assumes the god form of Osiris. And then he is able to get on the Milky Way, which they call the Street of Stars in the pyramid texts. So it's the same model. And we know of no communication between them and the Egyptians, right?
Something that I have found very fascinating is the fact that the spiral is constantly there. Mm-hmm. There's constantly a spiral. And in Newgrange, there are spirals all over the place. In a lot of the rock art in Europe and here, the spirals are there. And what I find fascinating is most of the time, they spiral clockwise. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if it had, I mean, this is going to sound stupid, but in the northern hemisphere, when the water goes down the drain, it goes spiraling right ways. Mm-hmm. And in the southern hemisphere, it goes the other way around.
That's right. That's right. And that brings up an interesting connection in regard to the icons of the Native Americans in the Southeast. They have a very common symbol that you'll see, a circle with an equal-armed cross in the middle. And when you see this, it indicates a portal, just like the Ogi, but one that's here. We don't have to leave to get to it. There are ways we can travel up or down on the axis mundi, on the tree of life that connects all the planes of the cosmos. And when we see there's one that instead of a cross, we'll see it has a swastika kind of image in it. And that's that cross in motion. The swastika is the cross spinning. And when we see it spinning, that's an indication that the portal leads to the below world, just like the water goes down. Okay. And for them, any body of water was seen as a portal that could lead all the way into the below world. whether it be the ocean, a lake, a river, or even just a puddle of water. I mean, it's not that they saw a puddle and imagined it was never ending. It could be a space they were very familiar with and knew that normally there's not water there, but now it is because of rainfall. They were very aware of that. They're smart people.
Yeah.
But once the water is there, the water itself makes it an entrance into the below world. And it immediately makes me think of catoptromancy, right? Mirror gazing, crystal ball gazing.
Yeah.
It's the practice of gazing into a reflective surface and using that as a mechanism of trance induction, right?
Yeah.
Great point. Yeah.
No, I just noticed our time. We could go on forever here.
We sure could. We could do a part 2 at some time if you want to.
I think that would be great. I would look forward to that. I think that I want to remind people the name of the book is Tripping the Trail of Ghosts, Psychedelics, and the Afterlife Journey of the Native American Mound Cultures. And there's so much material we didn't get into that I think a part 2 is definitely called for. But I want to thank you so much for spending your time and your energy. And I think that one of the things I was so fascinated with was that the North American indigenous people had ayahuasca-like substances up here, and you don't hear about people trying to replicate that particular substance, and yet they go for the ayahuasca down in South America. And I would imagine they're probably very similar experiences. I don't want to have either of them, but
they are, and that's one of, in my own perception of the book and what I was able to accomplish with it. I think that is perhaps the most important discovery in the entire work, and I say that because of its repercussions on how we think about ayahuasca and the use of DMT and where we allocate it to. Of course, to really get into that, we definitely should do a part 2 because it'll take me 10 minutes to go into the basics of it. But yes, that we had here in North America an ayahuasca analog that was being used in the exact, I will say it, the exact same ways as ayahuasca, because we know from a number of reports that the shamans were intentionally drinking ayahuasca in South America to get on the Milky Way. They said it outright. So yes, as hard to believe as that may be for some of you listeners who know your history and you know ayahuasca,
yeah, we had it here.
Got something to tell you.
Yeah. I just, it's fascinating. And I think that great respect has to be paid to the indigenous people, because they had a lot of different ways of getting to higher consciousness, for sure.
That's right. Advanced, brilliant, and lovely people.
Thank you so much for being here tonight with us. And don't go anywhere. I'm going to play our exit, and we will have to talk about your coming back again.
Let's do it. Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Totally.